Welcome to devMode.fm, a podcast dedicated to the tools, techniques, and technologies used in modern web development. I'm Andrew Welch from NY Studio 107.
I'm Jalen Davenport from Dominion Designs.
I'm Jonathan Melville from MDD in Atlanta.
I'm Marian Newlevant here in Portland, Oregon.
I'm Patrick Harrington from Mildly Geeky in Boston.
And today we have Jason McCallister from Trader Interactive. How you doing, Jason?
I'm good. How you doing?
I'm doing awesome. And we are here, or we have you here, and we are all here as well to talk about Docker. So if you were out herding yaks somewhere in the Amazon rainforest and someone came up to you, one of the guides came up to you and said, "Hey, Jason, I heard a lot about this Docker thing. What is it?" What would you tell them?
So that would probably be a really difficult conversation. But what I would kind of start with is that Docker is a good way to manage your containers. And that starts a whole different conversation.
Mm-hmm.
What is a container? That's where I put my food, right?
Right.
But that's
Right.
not really the case in this circumstance. So Docker is kind of like a really smart way to kind of deploy applications. Instead of having, your big typical virtual machine that has your RAM, your CPU, and Apache, PHP, MySQL, and whatever other requirements you have, containers take that to a nano level, if you will, where they focus on just that one single process. So they'll running PHP or MySQL.
So we did back in, it looks like June, we did episode number 14 on shootout at the local dev corral. And we covered just about everything, except we didn't cover Docker that extensively, except in the context of Nanobox using Docker. But let's give people kind of an orientation on this. So I realize that Docker is used for more than just local dev, but let's kind of do it in that context where. So if you're using something like Laravel Valet or MAMP, you kind of have your own kind of custom thing that's running on your machine, right?
Yes.
And then if you're using something like Homestead, you have a virtual machine that is a complete separate, usually Linux server that is sitting inside of running inside of your machine. And where does Docker fit in between these kind of local dev environments?
So Docker kind of can replace those altogether or replace just a few pieces of that. So like Valet is a really good example, which is unfortunately Mac only right now.
Right.
But Valet only handles the Nginx and the routing piece and running PHP, of course. So Valet doesn't really have anything to do with databases, right? If you look in their documentation, it says, well, you can run a database, you can brew install MySQL, and you're good to go.
Right.
But if anyone has ever actually done that, or even before brew is really bad, but if you've just done it with brew, even then it's kind of like, well, I've started it, what do I do now?
Right.
A good first step is kind of to get, something like Valet running and then spin up a MySQL container just to run the MySQL database and connect to it that way. So it's kind of like baby steps, right? If you need Redis, you can install Redis, but then Redis is running on your machine and then it's always going to be online, or MySQL will always be online. But with laptops nowadays, you typically don't want your whole web stack running at the same time. So it's a good method to get introduced to Docker is to kind of, run MySQL in a container and then, just use your Laravel Valet install to keep working.
That's really interesting because one of my big objections to, first of all, I'm not a huge fan of MAMP because you're using whatever custom things are installing. But one of the reasons why I don't use Valet is I don't really love the idea of installing, the appropriate version of PHP and MySQL and all these other packages directly onto my machine. So you're saying I can use Valet, but I can use Docker containers for these services instead of installing them via brew?
Yeah, absolutely. If you just wanted to install Docker for Mac or Docker for Windows or native Docker, if you have Ubuntu or something along those lines, then you can run your built-in web server. Say if you're on an Ubuntu machine and you just want to actually run Apache and PHP because you have it configured that way, but you don't want to install MySQL. Or, what's really cool is if you're like going to upgrade MySQL in production and you want to test it out kind of locally, then you just change your Docker run command or your Docker compose to have a 5.7, 5.8. They jumped to 8.0, which I don't know anything about that. So you can actually test your local installation and your application with different versions of MySQL without going through the whole installation process and you didn't remove these files. And, like if we start talking about Node, I'm going to have nightmares. But so it's kind of like it's very, very easy to swap out your infrastructure with code. So it's really, that's kind of was my starting point. Was I was like, I really like this Docker thing, but it seems really confusing. And how do I get the web server going? And how do I get this going? And I was like, well, let's start with the thing that I hate the most, and it's like a database, right?
Right.
So you could definitely just choose any version or pull the latest, and you can run that. And then when you're done, you Docker compose to stop it, or you kill the Docker container and you're good to go.
So that's really neat, because I've seen Jalen has written in some excellent articles on using Valet with Craft 3 and then also with Craft 2. But then I've also seen him fielding all of these, and he's been a champ about it, fielding all of these support requests for people who have issues connecting to the database in Valet, or some kind of a server issue. And you're saying, let's say that for instance, I installed MySQL 5.7 on my actual machine to use it with Valet, and then there's some kind of an incompatibility. You're saying that if I had done this the Docker way, I could just change the version and spin up the container again?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, there would definitely be some upgrade process that you would have to take, do a backup and then maybe re-import it. But,
Sure.
I can't remember which version of PHP, or I'm sorry, MySQL, but there was an issue with, it was the group by.
The group by, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So
I think it was 5.7.
I think you're right. And that was such a pain, because we had an application and we ran it and we're like, all right, great. Let's install this Laravel Forge server and let's get it going. And we ran it and like, what in the world just happened? So having that ability to kind of like change one single character in a file would have helped us kind of identify that earlier and been like, whoa, we can't actually deploy this, to production because we have 5.7, we need 5.6, and we need to make some changes.
So can we think of Docker containers, and it may not be entirely correct, but can we think of them as a mini VM that a specific service runs inside of?
Yeah, I think that made the most sense to me originally. Was okay, it's just a mini container, or I'm sorry, mini VM that runs one thing, but it's a little bit different. It's more about the process, right? Like if you follow any kind of, the solid principles or single responsibility of coding, then your VM, when you're running your VM, it has to install, like it takes 4 gigs of RAM. Let's say you're using Laravel Homestead, and you have 4 gigs of RAM and 2 CPUs, and then you have Apache and MySQL and Postgres and Redis and Beanstalk-D and whatever else comes with it. I don't even remember. All of those things are running, but they're consuming 4 gigs of your machine.
Right.
Just by default. Well, Docker, using a container, the image size, first of all, the VM machine is going to be probably gigs, right? At least like 1.5 gigs for Homestead, I'm pretty sure. And then, but when you do a Docker pull, because you're going to pull down MySQL just to run MySQL in a container, you're talking about 200 megs. If you look at things like Alpine Linux is like a very, very small Linux distribution that's made for containers. I think its base size starts at 3 megabytes. And you can install whatever you need to in that container, and then have a much smaller image. I think the one we have for our internal playbook is actually a ViewPress application, but it's an Alpine Docker container, and it's about 8 megs. So the deployment and pulling that down is super, super efficient.
So are you saying that each Docker container is effectively a Linux instance. Is that what you're saying?
It's a very fine-tuned Linux instance. You can look at it as, if it's running something in the foreground, like if it's MySQL, then it's running MySQL. It's not running the web server. It's not running anything else. The Docker file that the maintainer has written will just say the entry point is to run the MySQL command. It'll run in the foreground. It's that way the logs get output to the screen. So it's a little bit of less focus on running the other things that MySQL might need or your web stack might need, to be more specific, and more about like, hey, I just want to run MySQL. I don't care about anything else.
So you can almost think about it like the way that if you're in Composer and you're saying, I need this library, that library will pull along just what it needs in order to do what you've asked of it.
Absolutely.
It'll only pull out, part of Symfony and those components rather than the whole behemoth. This will pull out just the parts of Linux that it needs to accomplish everything MySQL needs or everything PHP needs or whatever it is, that core component that you're calling on.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good way to look at it. Is kind of like Composer. That's a perfect example.
That's cool. And I think I've always thought of it almost, it's like a VM, but smaller and tidier and maybe more portable. I've never thought of it as the ability to move around really distinct services as almost elemental as PHP or a database. How do they then talk to each other? What's the plumbing that allows, and you said you could use it with some other way of standing up your server on your local and just kind of swap out Docker containers for PHP. How typically today you have to put in your port, your username, your password, and I just count on my Mac to magically route everything together through paths and all that. Does Docker, expose a port and just kind of manage the in out of each Docker container, or how do they talk to each other?
So in the Docker file, like this, let's say Nginx, right? Nginx is a good example. They just expose port 80 in their Docker file. So then you can map traffic from your machine to that specific port, to that specific container. But when you run that command, when you do Docker run and you run that single container for Nginx, if you don't specify the port, it won't get exposed.
Okay.
So Docker handles all the networking by itself, right? So you can specify, I need what's the famous is an app net or the voting net, the network that it should run inside of. Or by default, it goes to its own bridge. I think bridge is the right term for that, but it goes to the default one. That way it's kind of exposed to the same piece on your machine. But what's really neat about Docker is since you're inside that container and you're inside their network, you can actually run multiple versions of MySQL and just not expose those ports to you. So you can't really, open up SQL Pro and connect to it, but you can essentially, when you're inside, let's say you're running PHP inside that network, you can ping and connect to MySQL by the service name. So if you have it MySQL-server or MySQL DB, inside that container network, the DNS that Docker creates will let you kind of talk amongst each other without having to configure, your host file or anything like that.
So in the case of of Nginx in a container, when I start it up or in the YAML file or whatever, I specify the port that I want it to run off of?
Yes.
And so then I just open up my browser and do localhost : that port number, and away we go?
Yeah, so what you'll do is if you know that the Nginx runs on port 80 and you want to map your port 8000, you'll pass a flag from Docker run via -p, then port 8000 : 80, which says, take my physical machine's port and network and route any request on port 8000 to this specific container on port 80.
Now, how can we do that by a domain name basis? So for instance, if I use, I don't know, devMode.test, is there a way that can be routed to the container?
Yeah, you can. What we like to do is we set up a proxy at work. We just take the vanilla Nginx container or image, and then we run that as a container, and we put our own configs. So API.local goes to localhost. But like we talked about with MySQL, if you have multiple applications, we have an API and a front end and Mongo and MySQL. we have all these services that we need to run locally. They can all talk to each other, but we test like our Mongo upgrades by running more than one version of Mongo with just a different service name. The same thing, you could just run it on a different port and have your proxy just say, port 5000 goes to port 80 here. But when you start exposing those, you will have some port collision, if that makes sense.
Well, and probably we could do it. A lot of people who are using the Mac are familiar with editing their Etsy hosts, right? And you probably could just do the mapping there, couldn't you?
Well, that will only take the domain name to an IP address. It doesn't really do
Right.
the port.
Oh, I thought it would do ports as well. Huh.
I'm not really sure. I've never used it for ports, but that would be interesting if you could.
Maybe it doesn't. But you're saying, okay, so you're saying that if we want to do this mapping, we have to have something in between that will handle that.
And that's where the Docker network comes into play. That'll handle all the orchestration and getting everything. And the Docker Compose file is probably the best bet there, because there's hardly any time that you're going to want to run a single container by itself, right?
Right.
You're always going to want to have MySQL, a database, a caching layer, a background queue, one of the things I've been trying to play with recently, yesterday, was getting Laravel Horizon to work in a Docker container. Since it wants to spin up multiple processes, I haven't really solved that yet, but it's the same kind of concept, right? Like, this container would do its one thing, and then I'd have a queue, and then I'd have the queue worker, and then I would have, the PHP FPM process, and I'd have Nginx. So it's kind of that's what I'm looking here for. It's kind of like a way to set everything together, right?
Yeah. I mean, I've long looked at Docker from the point of view of, I love the concepts behind this. Like, this sounds really, really neat that I can just containerize these things. And I didn't even think of the idea of using Valet, but instead of using Homebrew to install the packages I want, I could just use Docker to spin those things up, right? Because that'll be the pain with something like Valet will come when someone decides to upgrade their operating system to Mojave or whatever the next thing is, and it destroys their kind of local install, their local setup. And it sounds like this would mitigate it, because now, instead of actually installing this stuff on the actual machine, we just have a YAML file that spins these things up in containers, right?
Absolutely. So we have a mix of operating systems on the team. A lot, like half the team uses Ubuntu. They run, Dell XPS 13s. They hardcore Linux people, love their Linux. Not for me. On the server, it's great, but I've always found like peripheral issues running Ubuntu images. So, but then we also have Windows. We have only a handful of people who want to run Windows. And then we also have Mac. So looking at Valet, you get a bunch of great things. You get HTTPS, you get, automatic linking and unlinking of sites. It's just really, really simple, but not everyone, has a Mac, right? So, so having a team, like you brought up, Mojave is coming out. Docker works great on Mojave. I've already tried it, so there's no concern that when I upgrade the team to Mojave, then nothing's going to work and we're going to lose 3 days of productivity because, it's all broken. But at the same time, we're also having some Docker issues. So it's kind of it's supposed to make things easier. Sometimes it makes things a little difficult. Sometimes we get a lot of permissions error with mapping volumes between Ubuntu machines and Mac machines. So it's not without its, issues, if you will.
I mean, any technology, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
Everything looks shiny and awesome. And then you realize that, well, while this has overall improved my life, it has brought in, a new set of issues that I then have to deal with. And we've encountered that, right, Jonathan? We primarily have been using Docker on some joint projects for the actual deployment process. And one of the issues that we ran into was the critical CSS.
Yeah, so this was a nightmare. I mean, we basically ran into an issue. It was very, very strange issue where Google's Puppeteer ran into an error because Docker had a problem with memory limits or something like that when trying to generate critical CSS. And I guess we ended up solving it by just not using Puppeteer. I can't even remember how we solved it, but yeah, very strange issue there.
So I know the way I solved it.
I think you know.
It sucked, but I mean, the long and the short of it is, we did what any good developer does, is we did tons of Googling, right, to try and figure out what was going on, and we ended up at this one issue page where it said getting headless Chrome working inside of Docker is very tricky.
And I think that was in Google's own repo for Puppeteer.
Yeah, right. And I just was like, oh God. Yeah. Like if the guys from Google are telling me that this is going to be tricky, like I'm just going to give up. But I mean, that's an instance of, not everything is dreamland, right? I mean, you are still going to have potentially issues whenever you adopt anything new, but we look at it from the point of view of, overall, are there some really big gains for adopting this? So, Jonathan, the way we ended up solving that was I forked the Webpack critical CSS plugin, and I revised it to use a version of Penthouse.
Oh, that's right.
That didn't rely on headless Chrome and instead relied on Phantom.js.
That's right. Yeah.
But we had to go through that pain just to get critical CSS building on our Docker container in production. And that was not fun, Jason.
It does not sound fun at all. But
yeah.
that brings up a good point. I think that a lot of developers, I'm guilty of this myself, we like to just get started, right? Like it's my way or the highway. Let's talk about repositories, right? Everything is a repository, or I don't even want to get into that conversation, but we take things to an extreme. We like to just code and get started. But the problem with Docker is if you try to get started, there's so much you have to kind of, take into consideration and think about, that if you just dive right into it, you're going to be like, this sucks. Like, this is the worst thing ever.
Who invented this
thing? Right. But, it's why it's better to take it slow and, start with just working locally. And, if you know that you have a Laravel application and it runs in the cloud, it uses, 17 queues and Redis, and, build a Docker Compose that will kind of mimic that environment, and just don't do anything with production or your deployment or your staging. Just get it working locally. And, it kind of mimics having like a production environment. Like we run queues out the wazoo, but we can run them locally too. So we don't have to do PHP Artisan Queue, or PHP Artisan Horizon. So it's just starting in those small steps, like the database and then the web server.
Yeah, and I love your idea of, and Jalen, I want to hear what you think about it. Like instead of using Homebrew to install all this stuff locally, you can just spin up Docker containers for the DB. What do you think?
I think it definitely sounds interesting. One of the things I was going to ask Jason, a lot of people, want to run different PHP versions with their different websites and whatnot, because obviously Craft 2 won't run on some of the newer versions of PHP. But is there a way with the Docker containers to run separate PHP versions per project?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, there's definitely there's a lot of different ways to do that. So things like Craft don't really have good testing. And I say that because I'm really spoiled with Laravel. And I haven't checked Craft 3 in a while, but Laravel makes it really, really easy to run your tests. So if you follow something like TDD, then you can, be rest assured that when you run your test, you're probably going to catch most of that. So what a good step would be if you're running something like Laravel is you can define a build process that goes through PHP 7, 7.1, 7.2, and runs like PHP unit. And you can kind of get a good indicator of, this is definitely going to break on PHP 7.2. How do we go about fixing this? So
well, I think what Jalen means is he knows, for instance, that this version of Craft will not work with this version of PHP. Can he explicitly just make a container for the old version of Craft that has a different PHP from the container for a new version?
Yes.
Right. Yeah, because like right now, if you want to switch, like let's say you're moving from a Craft 2 project to a Craft 3 project, or maybe you're even running like an old EE website or WordPress website. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but let's say you have one, and you can't run this on PHP 7, so you have to download via Brew, PHP 5.6. Then you have to go through all the trouble of like stopping PHP 7, unlinking it, then linking PHP 5. I did write a helpful little script to do it for you, but it's just still a lot of work. But if you could like have, a Docker container per project that would be running the PHP you need, that would be really awesome.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. So what you could do is assign, basically create a Docker file in that project, and you can say this is from PHP 7 or 5.6 or 5.5 or whatever version you need, and kind of use their core version to get that running. So you don't have to go through that, because I honestly lost you after the brew unlink, because I have gone through that so many times that I tried to kind of space out when we start to go through that. Because I remember the first time when they actually switched all their casks or whatever they call it over, and all the documentation you found online was out of date.
Yep.
Yep.
So
I can't tell you how many people I had to help with through that process.
Oh, it's
yeah, Jalen. I think this is kind of exactly what Docker can help you do. Is that you can just have, as he was saying, you can have a Docker file that says, I want this version of this, and these are the containers I want. And you do Docker compose, and they're running, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So now when people come to you, Jalen, you can say, just use Docker.
Right.
Well, you gotta get it working yourself first, though. Marion, do you have any thoughts on Docker at all, in terms of, or any questions that you want to jump in there and ask Jason?
Well, I've tried to play with it, and kind of got.
It has a cute little whale icon.
It has a cute little whale icon, and but I haven't been able to make the leap from, doing a couple of cute little things from the getting started with Docker documentation to actually using it. So my story in there's our clock going. Sorry.
Oh no.
I said, Andrew's going to ask me a question. Right,
you can't call on Marion on the 15s, yeah.
Oh, that's my fault. That's my fault.
Anyway, so like I started off with this craft development. I went, oh, okay, I have a Mac, and I'm gonna get it to run Apache and MySQL and so on and all of that stuff. And that kind of worked in a fragile way for a little while, and then something changed and it all broke. And I looked at MAMP, but I was cheap and I wasn't willing to pay for MAMP Pro, and I had more than one thing I wanted to run. And I've ended up with Homestead, and I think I have like an early version of Homestead that is kind of limping along for me, and I don't dare change anything. So it would be really nice to have something that not necessarily works out of the box, but that I can make a box that it works out of. And Docker sounds very appealing, but I want to be able to, switch between 6 or 8 different craft installs, or have them all sort of up at once.
Yeah, I think, Marion, that they will kind of do what you want. And so the dream scenario is that every one of your craft projects has got a Docker file in there. And when you switch to work on one, you'll do your Docker compose, and everything will start running, and
so is this
everything
Docker
will work.
file a YAML file?
It's its own unique file, but the Docker compose file kind of so if you take if you want to do Docker run hello world, right? I think is their default when you first get started.
Right.
That's running one container, right? Based off their hello world image.
Right.
So what you would do is, instead of running Docker run Apache, Docker run PHP, Docker run MySQL, your Docker compose can listen and say, okay, well, you just said Docker compose up. I'm going to look at all these services I have in the Docker compose YAML file, and I'm going to start Redis and MySQL, and I'm going to keep them running, right? As long as they don't exit.
Yeah, I was referring to it wrong. What I meant to say was the Docker compose file, because the Docker file is what defines the container itself, right, Jason?
Well, it defines the image, right? So
the image, right?
And the image is like PHP Apache, right? So PHP is a standard library namespace, if you will, for Docker. So there's all different variants. There's 7-2 Apache stretch, and I think they have an Alpine. Maybe they don't. But then there's also PHP 7.2 CLI. There's PHP 7.1 and 7.0 and so on and so forth. So they publish those in what your Docker file, and each one of those will get a Docker file, and hopefully they have like an automated build process, which I'm sure they do, where
those
they make
are
a change.
Those are not quite binary files, or they're
text.
They're text, and somebody else writes them. Typically, for us beginnery people, we wouldn't be writing Docker files. We would be finding Docker files that somebody else has written and
kind of like a composer package, like Patrick was saying earlier, kind of like a composer package.
Absolutely.
I need X thing.
Yeah, so your Docker file can say from, right? Because you can do from scratch, which nobody really needs to do. But you can do from PHP 7.2 Apache, and you will inherit in your Docker file, when you run that, everything that is in that specific image. So what ports they expose.
And that's a well-defined thing. I could say from PHP 7.2 Apache, and Docker, the little blue whale, knows what that means. I don't have to define it. Okay.
Yeah, you don't have to do that work. And that's kind of where the extending images is kind of really useful is, when you choose, this is my stack, I prefer Nginx. A lot of people like Apache. When you're pulling down, you're going to define, let's say you need PNCTL, which is a PHP piece to run Horizon. Or you need, the Postgres driver or extension for PHP. So you can say, I want to take from the standard PHP image, and I want to get 7.2, and I want the Apache version. And then you can say, okay, but after I do this, I want to run these commands to install these extra extensions I need. I need MB string was the big one for Craft, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then what you do is each time you define a run, that becomes like a layer and a cake. So when PHP updates their 7.2 to the latest version, they push out a patch. Then you can, pull down their latest one and then rebuild your image, and you're already up to date. So it's kind of like a chain.
Yeah. It's kind of like calling Composer Update to update all of the packages that you have. And this is where the compose part of it comes in, right, Jason? Where all of these, let's say that we need Nginx, and it requires a number of things to run, and we're also requiring PHP. It then kind of composes what all of these things need together. Is that how it works, kind of?
Yeah, and using the composer reference for the PHP composer is really good, because you want to run Laravel 5.7, and you want to run. You need to have this PHP extension installed, and you define those dependencies in your composer.json. But the Docker Compose does the same thing, but instead of code dependencies, it's your service dependencies.
Neat. I mean, I love the idea of this, but whenever I look at a new technology that I might be interested in adopting, I try to look at it from the point of view of not, do I think this is neat? But what are the real kind of benefits that I'm going to be getting out of it? And so far, what I've heard from you are, or the benefits that I'm taking away from what I've heard, is that, first of all, we can specify exactly what a particular project needs, right? So like Jalen was saying, if I want a specific version of PHP for this project, I can easily do that, which is great. And another benefit, at least to me, is that it is not locally installing these things on my computer. So if everything goes to hell, all I do is, spin up a new composer package, a new Docker container, and away we go, right? Like if it doesn't work with this version, I change the version, I spin it up, and away we go. I'm not uninstalling and reinstalling and reconfiguring things, which sounds fantastic to me. But one of the other Sorry.
filling up your hard drive with ancient, weird, broken, unworking stuff.
Yeah, and then then things can just completely break, and then you're mortified to upgrade to a new version because who knows what's going to break, or you get a new computer, and the process of getting it set up is horrible because you have to reinstall all of this stuff. I mean, it just sounds terrible.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the other big benefits, at least, another benefit is working in teams, as you mentioned, Jason, where no matter what operating system they're running on, doesn't really matter. They can all use the same stuff, right? So, I mean, that sounds really nice when you're working with teams of people. But one of the other big benefits, at least in my mind, has always been that we can use the same thing throughout our whole pipeline. We can use it in development, we can use it in staging, and we can use it in production. Is that something that you do?
Yeah. So what's really neat about Docker is that you are treating your servers as like throwaway stuff. Your containers, and you just need somewhere
Right.
to run those containers. So
Mm-hmm.
your infrastructure becomes code, right? Because we're talking about setting up, all these different operating systems and who's got what. And I've spent some time setting up someone's local MAMP and configuration.
Oh, I'm sorry.
For hours, and that's actually Lindsay DeLoretto, but I'm not saying any names.
I'm sorry, Lindsay.
But I don't mind helping, but it's a pain. It absolutely is a pain.
Right.
So when we've gone through that process of getting started locally, and we've kind of getting our familiarity with what is Docker and how does it work and what's Docker Compose, well, then we can start. The next step we usually like to take is to let's put that in our CI/CD pipeline. If you have PHP unit or your tests that you have to run, so you can kind of build that next step, right? If you use Jenkins, or if you want to use something like Circle CI, I think Circle CI does Docker now. Well, you can integrate that in your tests. And what's really neat is that Docker Compose lets you define kind of your core services. So when you're running your test, you run your tests inside that Docker container, right? And then you don't have to expose that stuff. So imagine you have one Jenkins server that runs your tests, and your tests have Mongo and MySQL and Apache. But to run those tests, they just need to run inside that container. You don't have to expose those ports in CI/CD, so you can run 50 at a time, as much as your server can handle. So when you talk about going from local to CI CD, you're getting a little bit of those benefits where if you don't have to update Jenkins to run the latest PHP version, the latest Node version. I don't even want to talk about that. We've had so many Jenkins jobs break because someone decided to upgrade Node and didn't tell anybody.
And then boom, goes the dynamite.
Nothing is working. I don't know why. It's because we're on Node 4 instead of Node 8 or 10 or whatever number they're on. So that's like the next step, is kind of getting that into the pipeline for building and deploying. But that brings in, I think, some interesting questions as well. Isn't the whole purpose of Docker to have the exact same thing locally as in production? And with PHP, especially PHP unit, we need Xdebug. So that's kind of where we go back to that whole extending images. The images for PHP 7.2 are already defined. You pull that down. I always have to have like a development folder, which just extends from that base image that I create for the project.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
And that only thing that it does is it says from whatever my container name is, and my image name is, I'm sorry, and it says install Xdebug.
Right. So we could then use the same image in development, if we've got a CI build stage, and then on our staging server and our production server, but we could then extend it for development and testing, deployment, to add whatever things we needed in specific to that environment, is what you're saying.
Absolutely. And Docker has a newer thing. I'm not sure which version it came out in, but it has multi-stage builds. And this is really, really good for web development, because if you have your node dependencies, your composer dependencies, your PHP unit. Those are artifacts. You don't actually want to run those. You want to kind of treat those as one-time, throwaway containers that do tasks. Well, when there's a Laravel news article, I think it was Paul Redman who published it, talked about how to use that with a Laravel project. And he defines 3 stages in one Docker file, where the first one, it kind of goes through, gets the composer packages and the composer JSON, composer lock, installs those in a container in different run commands. And then he does a node one and installs node and does the build process for production. And then he does the PHP Apache one and can basically put his entire stack in a repeatable build process. But what's really neat about that is the way he has in his tutorial, he has it kind of set up where you can have those cached. So how often are you updating Composer? Not that often. So when Docker's running through that build process, it's the exact same commands I got last time. So I don't actually need to do anything. Let's use the cache, right?
Yeah, and that's something that Buddy does for you, which is really neat in the deployment process. Is it will do that. It will spin up the Docker containers and it will cache them so that you're not, God forbid, reinstalling Node and all the Node modules on every deployment, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
Go ahead.
I think another good, obviously, once we talk about CI/CD, we're going to look at production, right? And this is where it gets really, really tricky, and that's why I can't stress just take it slow, do something simple. If you have a personal blog, just do that. I wouldn't put on.
I don't want to take it slow, man. I want it all now.
All right, well, let's do it. So there's so many choices, and when it comes to actually getting into production, because if you use AWS or if you use Heroku or DigitalOcean or Google Cloud, or you want to self-host it, right? That's a very different conversation, and how you kind of go about getting that done really depends on what your application stack looks like. We use a lot of AWS, and I can't tell you how frustrating it is to use anything in Amazon Web Services.
You can tell me, because I feel your pain. I've been there.
It's painful.
I think the only thing worse is probably Google Cloud or App Engine, whatever they call it. I can never find. I got a pretty expensive bill because I tried something out, and apparently I left it running for a month. And what is this charge? I don't have anything at Google Cloud. And I looked and oh yeah, you've been running a Postgres service for a month. And I was like, oh great,
congratulations.
Yeah, doing nothing. So it's really if you're familiar with, I love Heroku, which really is a wrapper around AWS, but Heroku makes it super simple because there's never a time where I want to go manually do something to a server, right? I did server admin for a very long time, hated life, right? Setting up the servers was fun and getting it started, but that it was this PHP doesn't work because, I'm talking about PHP 5.4 was brand new, right?
Right.
And, I got this version of Python and the script doesn't work anymore. And, it's not performing right. No, it's really troubleshooting. I don't want to troubleshoot. If I can reproduce that as a Docker file and I can just delete that server and start over, my life is happy. So
I totally agree. I mean, I have long had the view that we should view both our local development and the servers that everything runs on as completely disposable, and set everything up from that point of view. But let me run you through kind of a real world scenario. So what we do currently, I use Homestead for local dev. And then we have a build process with Buddy that spins up a Docker container, does the build, and deploys it to a Forge server, right? So let's say that we adopt Docker for our local development. We get the nice benefits of using it there. We can pick the version that we want and have a per project setup. And we're already good to go with Buddy because it can use our Docker compose file and it can leverage that. But in production on a Forge server, how do we then get it running our containers there and the public Nginx server and everything mapped and working in that environment?
In that environment, it's not that you can't do it; it's that you more shouldn't.
Okay.
Because Forge is made to, it's like Valet, it's like Homestead. Yep.
It's a provisioner.
Yeah, you just throw your stuff up there, good to go.
Mhm.
What you need is something that can kind of do like an orchestration of your containers and your services. And Docker has some tools for that, like Docker Swarm and Kubernetes. But Kubernetes is kind of a beast, right? We'll go back to the whole taking it slow. If you just stepped into like building containers and trying to get it working, and then you're like, okay, 5 minutes in, let's go to Kubernetes. You're going to do the same thing. You're going to quit. You're like, this is too much. Like,
it's like getting off your couch and saying, I'm going to run a marathon today.
Yeah, kubectl, and like why can't I automatically deploy this stuff? Why do I have to go on a server and run these kubelet commands or whatever they call them? I should be more familiar with Kubernetes, but anyways, it's kind of like you have to choose like a different infrastructure. You can't just bake it into Forge because you're just going to spend more time working around, that the fact that they want to keep, port 80 running and 443 and et cetera. So,
I mean, I guess where I'm coming from this is that I've long had the belief, and it's a belief, right? It's not necessarily grounded in fact. It's just grounded in my understanding of these things. But my longstanding belief has been that one of the big gains from using Docker is that if I'm using it in local dev and if I'm using it for my testing, I really want to be using it in my production environment, because that is where, part of the big gain in theory is that everything is running in the same environment, so there won't be surprises. So if I can't use Forge, what do you recommend that I use for deploying this stuff into production?
As much as I don't like Amazon Web Services, it's kind of really powerful. And there's definitely a shift in kind of, what people are using to deploy Docker. You could definitely go through your own, server and just follow like DigitalOcean and just spin one up and kind of manually build the process. Buddy would probably be pretty good at that. Logging your server and Buddy would tag when it runs and your test pass and everything's good to go. It could tag that image as latest, and then your Docker side, whatever side that is, would pull it down. So it's really hard to say that there's a specific one that you could choose. But essentially what would happen is once your CI/CD part is completed, you tag that image as it is right then and there as your,
good to go.
Good to go. Your namespace application : latest, or master or production or whatever you decide. A lot of people do the production tag, so it is production because it defaults to latest, which is kind of like your develop branch. So then your infrastructure would say, okay, there was a build, trigger this thing, pull this down, and replace all these pieces out. The ECS from AWS is very confusing. It uses a lot of terms that are not Docker specific. So when you look at it, I'm like, what's a task definition? And like, why am I defining this service in this cluster? And it's not to say that it's not a good solution, but it's just very different from, DigitalOcean makes things very simple. I'm really spoiled by that. But moving into AWS is like, whoa, what is all this stuff? So I would say that if you are going to do this in production, it's best to kind of gear towards Kubernetes. And that.
Well, tell me, am I wrong in my belief? Like, are there benefits to using Docker and not worrying about production and saying, okay, you know what, production is still going to be this Forge managed server? I mean, would I still get benefits from using Docker?
You would still get benefits. Your local dev, especially if you're on a team, not in production specifically with Forge, but your local development is a cinch to set up because new team member comes on, they run 2 commands, they have their entire stack like they would in production ready to go. There's no surprises. Your CI/CD pipe can be faster and more efficient. because you're using caching and you're just pulling Docker containers and throwing away when you're done. Less maintenance, right? And then when you get into production, your CI/CD piece becomes very crucial, right? You'd want to automatically kind of load balance your application. So your belief is not wrong. It's just it really depends on what provider you go with, right? Because some make it really easy, some make it really difficult. But like that's why Heroku is still one of the best platforms, because it is so simple and everything's based on code. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, and I've used for Heroku for a couple of projects. One of the things that I disliked about Heroku was their ephemeral file system, which doesn't play particularly nice with certain things that Craft wants to do in terms of the cache files and some other things that are stored on there. So, I mean, I guess what you're saying is that for the production end of things, because I'm if I'm going to make the change over to Docker, at least in my mindset, and I'm ready to be convinced that I'm wrong, but I'm thinking about, well, I really want this to be end to end. And you're saying that if I want that, maybe it makes the most sense to change the production end to be Heroku or something else, right?
Absolutely. And that's a good point to kind of bring up, is when you start to treat your containers as throwaway things that are reproducible, that's where things like Forge and Server Pilot don't really come into play, right? And that's why it's such a hard question to really answer is, well, what's the best provider? If you're going to have all of your client sites in Docker and you're going to build the Docker thing of like the future, right? And your entire company is hosted in Docker containers. Well, there's a level of setup that's going to be required. How do you route to specific ports, and how do you do service discovery, and how does it connect to MySQL? But with even like with Heroku, it has ephemeral file storage, but so does Docker, right? So that's why you have to kind of follow the 12-factor app mentality. Is everything is a configuration file, an environment variable, and can be thrown away. So moving your caching to Redis is like a good approach, and moving.
Yeah, and I'm already using Redis in the production servers just for other benefits, and that is what we ended up doing when we deployed the Heroku app. Is we just set that up with Redis, and boom, away everything went. Yeah, I guess I'm just looking for a nice, neat end-to-end answer. Like I would love if there was some kind of and there may well be, and I just don't know about it. I would love if there was kind of like a Forge version of Docker where we're like, okay, or they're like, okay, ship us your Docker container and we'll take care of the rest in terms of mapping. Is there anything that comes close to that?
Heroku has they've been building it for a while, and it just, I think it came available last year or maybe like a year and a half ago, but they have their own kind of registry where you can publish your Docker images and kind of have that pipeline where they build it for you and they deploy it and they manage the load balancing. But also, there is definitely a big change. And I'm saying Docker Swarm and Docker Cloud was a great way to get started. That you just say, connect to DigitalOcean, give me 3 clusters this size, hit a button, boom.
Yeah.
They shut that down.
Come on.
So
that's what I want.
So what? It's weird to see. It's almost like Docker, the company, bit off a little more than they could chew. And I'm not sure if that's actually the case. But they shut down Docker Cloud. The new version that came out this year of Docker for Mac, or Docker CE, whatever they call it now, has Kubernetes built into it, right? So you can see that they're realizing that Kubernetes is kind of taking over, and Kubernetes was built off of Google's itch, right? They're like, getting this into production sucks. So how do we kind of build a tool that'll do a lot of this for us? So it's kind of, Kubernetes seems to be the clear way to go, and it's kind of everyone's moving that way. But then again, it's really just a wrapper, just like Docker is a wrapper around Linux containers, and Kubernetes is a wrapper around Docker. So they're kind of all abstractions.
So you're saying that AWS has facilities for doing this stuff, just the nomenclature and some of it, and this is nothing new with AWS services, but just that it's a little bit muddy.
Yeah, so the Elastic Container Service, and they have the Elastic Container Registry. All these names drive me bonkers.
Yep.
But they've got a really good process, and what we do is for us is when we're ready to deploy or swap out our services, if you will, we tag our image latest on the Jenkins server when the builds pass, and then we push that to the ECS. We run a command that's like ECS force deployment, something like that, where it says, okay, you define your task, which is your quote unquote cluster of services. You want 3 versions of, let's just say, Nginx running and load balanced, right? So you say, okay, this new image has passed and it's good. This is what I want to promote to production. So then you run a command, an AWS CLI command that says, don't remember off the top of my head, but it says, okay, make 2 more versions of these. And when there's no more traffic going to the other 2 that are old, if you're running 4, right, then we'll swap them out. So then there'll be 2. So for a minute, there'll be 4 services or 4 containers running. And then once the traffic goes to the other ones, it kind of just lets those disappear.
Yeah. So the long and the short of it is that they have services that will take your container image and kind of handle the rest of the magic for you. Right?
Absolutely. Yep. They'll handle the load balancing and turning off and pulling down the latest. And they even have EKS, I think is. So they have Elastic Kubernetes service, right? Everything's Elastic.
See, I kind of feel for like some people who are listening, maybe they're freelancers, and it almost sounds like the full development to production aspect of this seems like a full-time job for several people. In terms of, if you're doing this inside of a company that has the staffing to do it, then it very well may make sense. Even if you work at an agency with a number of people that, do graphic design and development, you may or may not have the staffing to do this. Is that fair to say that you really do kind of need a little bit of staffing to do this? Or do you think that your average freelancer or small agency could realistically scale this up and do it end to end?
I think a lot of that is going to be on the tools they use, like which provider, right? And that's kind of like a cop out, but it depends. It's the one time you get the build process working on your infrastructure for your pipeline, then you're set.
Then you celebrate because you just replicate it everywhere else, right?
So it's kind of one of those things where it might not be the best part for, or best solution for a smaller company, an agency style work. An organization, I mean, we don't have people that manage, we have a DevOps guy, but we don't really have, like, on our side of the company, we don't have like a DevOps group. So our engineers have to understand our infrastructure, right? So they have to be a little bit responsible about that. I think it makes for a really well-rounded developer that makes a really, really, that quote unquote unicorn of full stack. So
full stack. First, this is like triggers me. It's like the one word that triggers me.
I'm with you.
Full stack is BS. Okay, it means nothing.
Yeah, we were having that discussion the other day. It's like, full stack means you're mediocre at everything.
Yeah, or full stack is just you're basically lying on your resume. I mean, because whatever. I do tons of DevOps. I do back-end development. I do front-end development. I do all this kind of stuff. And I would never say that I'm full stack. I think it means nothing.
It means you're doing well at buzzword bingo.
Yeah, it's just, I don't know. It just irritates me. Anyway, I want to ask, and I guess I'll start with Patrick. Patrick, what do you think of this whole thing? Are you interested in Docker, and what parts of it do you think that you might bite off and kind of start chewing on?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds interesting, and I mean, I can almost see myself using some of it for local development. My issue is I think it would be hard being in client services to then make the full push into using in production. So many times, sometimes we're able to dictate what the end host or hosting setup will be, but a lot of times we don't. For there may be legacy hosting, and
I'm sorry, Patrick. I just thought of. Can you imagine you get a client that's on GoDaddy shared hosting?
I have a client right now that is on HostGator, and which is basically the same thing. And we're talking about.
And you're going to try to deploy your Docker containers to HostGator.
Yeah, and I mean, well, if someone is up on Docker and is ready to go, it's great for them. I think it also, there's a concern that with any new technology that it then means that there's a small subset of developers that would be ready to stand up their own local Docker instance and get up and going. I mean, Lindsay, I guess, is now ready to go, but that's one.
Right.
I think you could just use the new Elastic HostGator service.
The Elastic HostGator.
EHG. I like it.
Jonathan, what do you think? I mean, we're considering doing some stuff for new projects. I mean, do you think it's worth the investment to try and bite something off to get end-to-end Docker stuff going?
So, yeah, I definitely see the benefits right off the bat for local development, and I'm already sort of going that way, like away from the homestead for local development, more towards the Docker containerized services for that. But I'm like you in the sense that if I do it that way, I really want to make it work end to end. Like I don't want to sort of do like a patchwork of different ways to do development. If I do it locally, I would love to have it running in production the same way. I think sometimes it comes down to like, do you even really does this benefit your client to do this? Do you have the budget to support it? Are you going to be pulling your hair out when you can't you're just trying to do something simple? It'd be super easy to do on Forge, but you're like literally about to throw your computer out the window because you're trying to do it. Does it make sense? I would love to try it. I'm not going to say that I'm not going to attempt it with this project coming up, but maybe I'll call Jason crying one night and get him to.
Jonathan, if we do decide to do it for this project, first of all, I know that I would be tasked to do a lot of this. I'm going to buy like a Nerf helmet so that when I don't damage my monitor when I'm
exactly. I mean, I have sort of like a practical question. I don't know how much time we have left, but
go.
So Jason, what would you tell somebody who's listening to this and they say, you know what, this sounds great. I love the idea of playing with Docker. I kind of want to see what it's all about. Where do I even begin? Because I mean, something like this is so complicated. There's so many resources online. I mean, would you say go to the Docker? Would you just read the docs, or is it like trying to read the Webpack docs where you're like, forget it? I mean, what resource would you tell someone who is completely new to all of this, but they want to try it? Where would you point them as a starting point?
That's a really good question. So I would actually recommend a few things. The best course, hands down, is the one by Brett Fisher. He's local to Hampton Roads. It's on Udemy. It's a Docker mastery course. As typical Udemy fashion, it's on sale, so you better hurry. You have 5 hours left.
So everything's always on sale.
But it's like $12. It's fantastic. It is such a good resource because what he will do is he will take you through the whole process of what is Docker, installing it, setting it up, doing the Docker run commands, explains the whole thing, and then he talks about getting into production, right? Mm-hmm. So, but he does it in a really slow, steady, well thought out fashion that I think is a really good starting point. It's we go back to this, just start local. Don't get crazy and instant to prod, because I'm going to challenge your belief now, Andrew.
Do it.
I'm going to say,
do it.
Is it really the fact that you want to have Docker in production, or do you just want to be able to git push and then be done with it?
It's really my OCD, and every time I say that, people complain that I'm making fun of a real disease or whatever. But no, I mean, really, it just kind of feels to me that if the point of doing this is that I can spin up specific versions, that I'm going to want the same thing in my local dev that I have in my production server. And I don't want there to be surprises when I let's say that I keep it for local dev and then I push it into the production Forge server. I don't want there to be surprises in it not working because the environment is different. But I think you're right that ultimately all that I really want in the end is that when I push to the right branch, it deploys and it works.
Yeah, no one wants to do server troubleshooting.
Yeah, and I do that quite a bit, and that makes me not want to do it. You know what I mean? Like, if you've been there and done that, you do everything you can to avoid having to do it. And I guess from my perspective, I just wish that there was some kind of a really nice Forge-ish service. And by saying Forge-ish, what I mean is that something that handles a lot of this stuff for you, but also exposes the guts of it should you need to want to change it around and do stuff with it. But actually, Patrick made a really good point that I didn't even think of, that we don't always have control over where this stuff is going to be deployed. It's all well and good if you work at a company and you can make decisions about where your infrastructure is going to be. But I would hate to have to start, turning down clients because I have to say, oh, well, you're not using AWS's ECS. We can't work with you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that seems like it would a difficult conversation to have. On the other hand, I think that Docker, and maybe not even Docker specifically, but the concept of containerizing these services is 100% the direction that things are going in. And I think as a marketable skill for you to be valuable coming into a lot of teams, I think having this skill would be super important. So, kind of getting your feet wet, doing it in local development probably is a good idea. But I want to give Marion also a chance to chime in and voice her thoughts on all of this.
Well, it sounds like one of the advantages is that when you do throw your computer out the window, it will be easy to get set up again on a new one.
Right.
Yeah, I'm encouraged to give it another try and see if I can get it working for local development. The degree of control I have about where things are deployed to production is so small that I'm just willing to completely let that idea go. Although it's a nice tidy idea that you just have this one thing and it would work everywhere.
Right. Yeah, everyone has to have dreams, Marion.
Yeah.
Jalen, what about you? You've been sitting here listening to all this. Do you think that it might make sense for you to start by swapping out some of the services that you're installing via Brew and start using Docker for that?
Yeah, I was really excited to hear Jason talking about that. It definitely sounds like an interesting approach. Probably something I'll try out in the future. And then, if it seems to work well, maybe eventually switch over to like full blown Docker, even all the way up through production. There was one kind of question I wanted to ask is, real end of this. And it's something I've always struggled with Docker. I kind of came from the Vagrant world or Homestead, where you've got like all the different parts you need to run your website, on one VM. And then you switch to Docker and everybody's talking about containerizing things. And so you've got, PHP in one container, Nginx, another one. I'd like to have Jason maybe answer why exactly you would want to containerize stuff.
So I think what makes it really helpful to think about is in PHP, let's just level set for a second. PHP is a little bit of a different beast. If you've written any kind of Go or .NET, and to go back to something we talked about earlier, .NET ships with a Docker file. But if you go to PHP, it's a little bit different because we need that web server, right? And then we need PHP to be running. So we actually have two services that need to run. They need to be able to talk to each other. So a good example is, let's say you have an application, and we're talking about production. This is fantasy land right now, where you have your Apache container that's sitting in front of a load balancer. And when that comes in, you're getting a lot of traffic, but your Apache container is kind of just a pass through, right? It's just sending data or PHP requests to PHP. Then you could behind the scenes say, well, I actually need 16 replicas of PHP. Let's say let's actually say Nginx and PHP FPM. I actually need 16 PHP FPM services running and just load balance between those two, because the Nginx container is handling traffic fine, but the PHP part was doing a lot of the work. It's a great example for a queue, right? If you're running Laravel, you say PHP artisan queue listen, and you put that in a container. So you have Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, and you can scale those out by themselves and they'll automatically handle traffic. So does that kind of make sense or kind of answer your question?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense thinking about it from the scaling point of view. Yeah.
All right. So I do have a question for you, Jason. How dumb is it for me? So a lot of I still use Homestead for my local development because I do find myself doing a decent bit of DevOpsy stuff. That, yes, that could go away if I end up getting Docker working end to end, but it doesn't look like that's going to be an immediate thing. How dumb would it be to run Docker inside of my Vagrant VM?
Well, it's not actually dumb because containers are really only supported on Linux. And when Docker for Mac first came out, you had to install VirtualBox and do this Docker bridge or Docker machine command, run this crazy nonsense. But what a lot of people don't realize is that Mac doesn't have native container support. So what Docker is actually doing is installing a virtual machine in the background just to make it very simple. So when you're using the Docker command and Docker run, you're actually talking to a virtual machine that is running. So it's actually not a dumb idea. That's exactly what Docker for Mac does.
I wanted you to tell me how stupid it was. Anyway, keep going.
It does the same thing for Windows, right? The idea is to be able to ship and have one interface. It's like I always compare it to the caching library or the facade in Laravel. Super powerful, but it does not care if you have Redis or Memcached, or I think there's a Mongo driver, or maybe that's just for the queue, but it doesn't care. It's the same layers. Docker run does not care where it talks to. You can actually have your local machine connected to a Docker machine in DigitalOcean. So you can actually be running those commands locally on your terminal, but they're actually executing in DigitalOcean.
Yeah, so here's my reasoning, and that, believe it or not, like long before we decided to talk to you, this was kind of the route that I was considering going down. And the reasoning was that I still do want to have an actual local Linux server, because I still do quite a number of things from a DevOpsy point of view that I want to be able to do them locally, and I want to be able to make it so that if everything goes to hell, there's no implications involved, right? And I said, all right, if I'm going to keep this around for that reason, maybe I can still get the benefits of using Docker containers by running them inside of that Vagrant VM. But that was sort of predicated on the idea of using the Docker compose file throughout the whole kind of development, testing, staging, production phase. You know what I mean? Like, I was kind of seeing Docker's real benefit to me then would be the fact that I can use it with other people. They can get up and running quickly. The fact that I could pick specific versions of things very easily on a per project basis. And then the other real benefit I thought was that I could deploy this all the way to production, and then I've got the matched environment all the way through. But do you think that it's a reasonable course of action for me to start using Docker inside of Vagrant just to kind of get some of the benefits out of it?
I think if you're going to use it in a virtual machine, you might as well just use Docker for Mac, or I think that makes the most sense, because you're almost doing the same thing but with a lot less work. Because then you have to figure out your networking and routing and stuff like that. And Docker for Mac will solve all of that for you.
So it'll make it easier to get that stuff set up. I mean, the unfortunate thing from my perspective is that I'm probably going to be running both then, because I don't know what would another good way of having a Linux VM around for me to experiment with be.
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question. I think there's how would I put this? If you run a Docker run and say Ubuntu, and then you do -it and you get in the terminal, you're essentially in a Ubuntu. I don't know which one's the right one. You're in an image, a container that is actually Linux. So you can do the uname and you'll see that, oh, it's actually Ubuntu. So if you want to, like, Docker's great for just trying something out. Like, I want to try to configure Apache, and I want to try this new mod that came out, whatever it is. Okay. Then you can just say, you can either build a whole Vagrant machine, or you can say, well, Docker run Ubuntu, and I'm going to install some stuff, and then just stay in your container. And then if you pass the --rm, the second you exit that container, your container's gone, right? So you don't have to like wipe the image and start over again. It's just, it takes care of it for you. So if you,
so I could make a Docker container called Playground that has the specific Ubuntu that I want, and then I can just spin it up and SSH in and do my evilness.
Yeah, you can do anything. I think you have to install a lot of stuff, obviously, because they strip some stuff out of there. But you could definitely run, like, I want to try, GCC, or I want to try this version of Go, which is where you go back to the whole Docker file. What you can do is do Docker run exec into it, which is kind of like SSH, and then run your commands. But then take those commands and put them in a Docker file. So like if you wanted to run a task over and over and over again, to do something like a ETL, extract, transform, load some files, you could do that in a Docker container without messing up a virtual machine or your machine. And then you can actually codify those by putting them in a Docker file, grab this file from here and do these steps and do these things. And you have a repeatable build process.
So I have a question. Sorry, I have a question about something you just said. So you were talking about like using the exec command. So like if you're using something like Laradoc, I guess they have a container called Workspace, and then you have like that. Then you have access to like Yarn and Composer and all that. So you would do exec Workspace bash to get a shell. What are you actually doing when you do it? Because I mean, I know you're not actually SSHing into like another machine, but you're kind of SSHing in. I mean,
you're actually. I don't know if it's. I think it's technically is SSH. You're SSHing into that container.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I think that's actually how it's functioning. But I guess so. Let's say that I do take this slow and I take it piecemeal, and I continue to use Forge to provision the production servers initially. But I want a local server to play around with that mirrors it. Is there a way to get the full Monty where I can get like Ubuntu 18.04?
Yeah, you can pull any version of Ubuntu they have published. If you go to the Docker Hub or the Docker Store, they're in a weird transition right now. I'm not sure where they're going to stick. But you can go to the Docker Store and you can see that, which versions and which are, what they're tagged. And what's really nice about that is if you dig deep enough, they don't really put a really good link to it. I haven't checked the store in a while, but you can actually go see where they define their Docker file, right, on GitHub, and you can walk through the steps. What are they doing? So you can actually look at that and say, oh, they're installing this, but I don't need that, right? We can get rid of that. So so I think since Ubuntu is based off of Debian, I think they actually extend.
Oh, neat. Yeah. That's really cool. They're doing it that way too. That's really neat.
So it's kind of like that's where you get your Scratch container, right? Where it does absolutely nothing. Right. So Go is really cool because if you wanted to, it has a built-in web server. So if you wanted to just run a single binary that was a Go piece that would listen on a port, you can say from scratch, and then it'll copy that binary in there and it'll just run that binary. You'll have nothing else inside of it. So however big your binary is how big your container would be. That's
neat. That's really neat. Oh, Jason, I think you have given me a monster rabbit hole. But I really have kind of been flirting with this for a long time. So I'm really excited to have you on and to get some information out of you. And hopefully we have given people a nice overview of all this. And I think one of the most interesting things that you said to me is that one of the main reasons why you're using Docker is you've administered servers for a very long time and you just don't want to have to do it anymore.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, that about wraps it up for another episode of the devMode.fm podcast. To have every episode delivered to your favorite podcast player, subscribe to our RSS feed or subscribe via iTunes or Google Play. And if you like what we're doing, please leave us a review. We would love to see that up there. You can also follow us on Twitter at devModeFM. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode. Leave us a comment on the devMode.fm website. For the devMode FM podcast, I'm Andrew Welch.
I'm Jalen Davenport.
I'm Jonathan Melville.
I'm Marion Newlevant.
And I'm Patrick Harrington.
And thank you, Jason, for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
I think that went pretty well. Jason, that was awesome. I really appreciate that we were able to kind of pump you for some info.
No, it's great. I enjoyed talking to you guys.